Hello, I'm Gabriel Fairman, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today at the AI in Translation Summit. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the founder and CEO of BureauWorks. I've worked with language my whole life. My mother was a translator. I began my career as a translator. I grew up speaking Portuguese, English, and Spanish, and then I fiddled a little bit with Italian, French, and Mandarin. I'm a big language lover. And I think a lot about what's happening right now in our industry. And one of the biggest parallels that I can draw is with the death of a religion. Whenever I think and talk about the death of something, people immediately think about something that's apocalyptic, cataclysmic, something that's irreversible. But what I love about the death of a religion, it's that it's a very slow, painful, and long drawn out process. A religion typically doesn't die overnight. A religion typically splinters and fractures into subsets of its own religions, into heretics and fanatics. The process is slow. It's all about erosion and it's all about deterioration. And when I think about what's happening in our space, it's actually pretty similar. We've had this culture that prevailed over the past maybe 2,000 years where humans were fundamental, indispensable vessels for understanding across languages. And generative AI has fundamentally defied that. I don't mean to say that it's good or that it's bad. I just mean that in the perspective of the executives that I talk to, generative AI is in many cases a plausible alternative to human translation. And generative AI is also seen as a major cost reducer. So our space has been driven by need, and the need has been driven by companies, typically large companies. Globalization was really propelled in the 80s by IBM, the 90s by Microsoft, and the 2000s by Google, and so on. It's these companies, these very large corporations shipping product to over 100, 180 different countries in so many different languages. They have really been the big pushers towards globalization and a wider need for scaling globalization and translation. And that need has always been all about efficiency, all about cost reduction, all about effectiveness in spending the least and getting the most. That's how every single company thinks. And generative AI is seen, like I said, as a plausible alternative to having a human translate. And executives also tend to think in a very dichotomous way. So they tend to separate. It's either generative AI driven or it's human driven. Similarly, most translators that I talk to tend to also separate these two worlds. It's either human made or it's machine made. And I think both camps end up overlooking what I believe is the birth of a new religion or a subset of this religion, which is a hybrid human machine world. And the reason I believe that that's the only way forward is because machines introduce efficiencies that are unfathomable to a human being. As an example, I will inevitably make more spelling mistakes than the machine will. Spelling mistakes are very predictable. They're very easy to detect for a machine. When I get sleepy, when I get groggy, when I'm tired, it's hard for me to detect spelling mistakes. Plus, I'm not a good speller to begin with. Just one tiny example of how a machine can be a lot better than me. No matter how much I try, no matter how much I study, a machine will be able to spell better than I will. Typing speed. No matter how fast I type, a machine will always type faster than me. So there's these things in which I simply cannot compete with a machine. And there are other things that I can add incredible value. When we're talking about embodied intelligence, when we're talking about emotional intelligence, when we're talking about awareness, when we're talking about cultural belonging, I have these things. They're natural to me. I don't have to pretend that I have them. I naturally have them. I have my own sense of identity. A machine doesn't have their own sense of identity, at least not now, not for the foreseeable future. Identity is something that's pretty special, and we have that, right? So in my mind, when we think about the kind of world that we can function in, it's a world in which we're sharing things with machines, we're working with them to overcome them, which is the origin of the title, God, Give Me Strength to Use AI, to overcome AI. Because most of the translators I talk to, they're in a few different lanes. They're either in the lane where they're just pretending like nothing is happening and they want to carry on as well as they can, doing whatever they used to do. Obviously, there's outside pressure. There's a call for more productivity, lower rates. There's a lot of pressure. But I know that there are many translators that I know personally that find their niche and stick to it. And whether it's because they're highly creative, whether it's because they're highly technical, they're often able to maintain that. Again, this parallel with the death of a religion, we start to see these little bubbles forming. And in each of these little bubbles, realities are completely different. I know of translators that are making more money post-generative AI than pre-generative AI. I know translators who have lost all of their income stream. These little bubbles are formed and they're highly contextual, right? It depends on the subject matter. It depends on the kind of clients they have. It depends on the language pairs they operate in. It depends on how they operate. It depends on the softwares that they use. But the overall trend, when you abstract from all these little bubbles, the overall trend is more for less. That's just, in a techno-capitalistic society, it's always more for less. That's always going to be the challenge. And the only way people can actually deliver more for less is through the use of technology. And again, this is where I see these little bubbles, and we've lost some common ground. Like maybe 5-10 years ago, if you called 10 translators to discuss what was an average expected productivity for a daily output, maybe most translators would say somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000, 4,000 words. That was maybe a lot of people would agree upon that. When we look at data from BureauWorks, people translating in BureauWorks, we see people translating all the way from 2,000, 3,000 words a day, all the way to 15,000 words a day. And then the first thought that will typically come to mind, the counter argument, yes, but with what quality do they produce those 15,000 words a day? And what's surprising is that it's with high quality. It's not like they're jeopardizing their quality for productivity. What's happening is that the translators that are able to get closer to 15,000 words a day, they're using a completely different set of tools, and they're using a completely different mindset. I learned to translate from my mother, and my mother was always looking for the best, the most impeccable way to translate any given sentence. It was an art. It's a beautiful art that she developed. But it took often forever. It took sometimes to translate a single paragraph. It would take her a few hours of research. Maybe she would have to learn about something that she wasn't super familiar with. Maybe she would rewrite it a ton of times. And the thing that always fascinated me about that is, as I grew, I realized that whatever was impeccable for her, not necessarily was exactly what her client wanted. And that's the thing about language, right? Language is something that's highly subjective, highly contextual, and what's best for me may not be best for you. Upon realizing that, we get into this really complex argument. And I don't like the term good enough because I think good enough could be the least worst. And I'm not a fan of the least worst. I'm a fan of good enough in the sense that it is a feasible, viable way of communicating that can be accepted. Maybe by you, maybe by me. Maybe it's not going to be my favorite, but it's also not going to be terrible. Maybe it's not going to be your favorite, but it's also not going to be rejected by you. And I find it in my personal experience that most translators I have worked with and I have known, starting with my mother, they have a very stern commitment to the utmost best way of expressing something. And that begins to fall apart with generative AI. Why? Because generative AI has a way of proposing something. Maybe it's not the best way, but it's a way. And sometimes the distance between taking that starting point to something that you can live with is very small. But the distance between taking that and to the way that you would express yourself in a perfect world with unlimited time and unlimited resources, that's going to be really big. And the door that generative AI opens that most people don't realize, most people think about generative AI as something that's analogous to machine translation, so as an improvement to machine translation. But the thing is that machine translation has and will be a one-way radio. And that's my opinion why it's so frustrating as a translator to work with machine translation, because it's offering something, but it's not learning from me. It's not adapting to me. It's not getting better. And that is the first thing that we attempted to do through context sensitivity. So context sensitivity is trying to go from a one-way radio to a two-way radio, where my changes, or my terms, my implementations, they begin to shape the way the generative AI is proposing suggestions to me. So when we talk about context sensitivity, we're not talking just about improvement to machine translation. We're talking about fundamentally changing the way that I relate to the tool that I'm working in. And in this case, I'm talking about BureauWorks. So context sensitivity is going from a mono-directional communication to a bidirectional communication. And I personally love that, because for me, the most frustrating part of working with machine translation is that it was giving me something, and often at the entire document level. And if I needed to change things, I needed to change things again and again and again. I needed to scan the document countless times for the same kind of errors that would literally plague my work. It was often less work. And even with kind of good machine translation, it was often less work to just get rid of it and do it on my own terms. But with context sensitivity, it's different. Because if I go ahead in context sensitivity, for instance, and let's say I add a term to my glossary, it's going to follow that. If I start to make changes to the terminology or to the style, let's say I make things less formal, it's going to begin to follow that. And I can create context sensitivity in BureauWorks the way I desire to make it. So maybe I want to put all of my work in a single context sensitive engine. All good. Maybe I work with different kinds of verticals, and maybe I have legal and marketing, and I want to put those things in different bins. I can do that. Maybe I want to separate them by my clients because they use different terminology and different styles. I can also do that. But this apparatus, this context sensitivity apparatus, is a bidirectional way. So it's learning from my actions so that the next suggestion is going to take less time for me to confirm. And for me, that's a much more interesting approach. But the context sensitivity is just layering in one little piece to a much bigger puzzle, right? When we talk about augmentations in BureauWorks, we're talking about all these additional auxiliary mechanisms that make translation a lot easier for me. For instance, I think I'm pretty good at getting the message across, but I'm not that good at spotting little typos, little mistakes that I introduce, especially after my 6th or 7th hour translating in a day. My focus becomes less accurate, less precise. BureauWorks smells, for instance, is always there. If I choose to turn it on, it's an agent that's looking for potential issues in the translation, flagging them to me. It's obviously up to me whether I want to click on the fix button or whether I want to ignore it. But it's suggesting those things to me. And because of that, I can relax. I can take it easy. I can take a breath, and I can work faster because I know that things will be flagged to me. And I can also work with less stress because I don't have to worry so much about the little details. I can focus more around the meaning. Thinking back again about this difference that I was saying, there are certain things that I have no problem acknowledging that a machine will do better than me, like typing, like being consistent, like finding spelling issues, grammar issues, like finding where the meaning is departing from a literal perspective, from the intended meaning. But I have the judgment calls. I have the ability to say, you know what? I'm using something that's deviating from the source, but it's by design. I want it like that. And that decision, that carries a lot of weight. It's not just a decision at the textual level. It's a decision that's going to be carried again and again for me, for my benefit. So what I'm going to experience is that as I work through time, the edits are going to become smaller, especially if I'm really diligent about creating these little engines in ways that make sense. Again, it won't help me if I start to mix marketing discourse with legal discourse, or chemistry discourse with biology discourse. These are different discourses, and I must keep them separate if I want the best possible results. But the key point that I'm making here is the more I accept that the machine can be highly beneficial, the more it frees up my cognitive load to focus on things that are going to add a lot of value, things that fundamentally make me human. And that, I believe, people are willing to pay for. And not just a little, a lot. But they're not going to be willing to pay for things that are mechanical, repetitive, predictive. So what does that do? That really raises the bar for what a good translator means. In the past, maybe 5-10 years ago, someone who typed fast and was pretty accurate was a phenomenal asset as a translator. In my opinion, 2025 and beyond, someone who types fast and is fairly accurate, they're going to be no better then some combination of generative AI plus machine translation plus trained corpuses. And again, think about this. There are a lot of companies that are investing a ton in linguistic engineering to create these very customized engines that for some particular discourses are performing incredibly well. But if you follow this trend and raise along your work with the bar, and you're the person who's making perhaps tiny changes, but very important ones, you're changing. I was giving an example the other day. The text I was translating was going from English, from Portuguese into English. I was translating something about our website. And in Portuguese, we were using the article a, so the indefinite article. So it would translate to English as the platform. And that's fine. There was no error. But I decided in English that I wanted to call, instead of the platform, our platform. Small little change. Huge impact, right? I'm going from the, something that's impersonal, to our, connecting the reader to our platform, to BureauWorks. It's a big stylistic decision. And in my opinion, a translator who can make those kinds of stylistic decisions, those calls, and can explain and justify those calls, they begin to carry immense value for the organizations that they're working with, because they're not just transacting, they're actually adding their voice. They're taking care of their brand. And in my opinion, so many translators already do that, but that gets lost in this barrage of words that need to be processed. And if these words are processed manually, it's very hard to give those little decisions the kind of time and attention that they really deserve. So when I think about the challenge that we face, is there is the death of a religion where the translator alone is capable and is the magician who's able to be the vessel that carries meaning across from one language to the other. That religion, in my opinion, is no longer a fundamental and solely standing religion. That religion is eroding very quickly. I also believe that this heretic religion that's popping up, where generative AI is good enough, is also fundamentally flawed. But I don't see enough people exploring, truly giving it the time. Because again, if I think about the case of my mother, she developed a way of translating over at least 40, 50 years of her career. It was very specific and very effective for her. But as technology changed, if she wouldn't change along with it, she wouldn't be able to keep up. So if she's still, for instance, spending hours researching terms, maybe she still needs to do that for specific cases, but if that's her workflow, she will never be able to deliver enough. And not just enough, but with enough added value. And that's another term that I think is eroding, the idea of quality. The idea of quality belonging to the source. In my opinion, that's also eroding very quickly. What matters to people is the impact that the text has on readers. So in this paradigm, when we think back again about the title, in my opinion, what's really necessary and what's really hard is the humility to take not just one, but many steps back and realize that maybe all this knowledge that was accumulated, all these processes and heuristics that were devised over decades of a career need to be rethought, need to be redone. And that's such a painful, complicated process to go through, because it involves the death of the ego. It involves giving up the idea that you know something so that you can learn something new. And that's incredibly hard to do. Maybe that's the hardest thing I could ever think that I would tell as a human being to do. Forget that you know something. Learn it over. Imagine telling a karate black belt to go back to being a white belt. It's not something easy. But in my opinion, it's the only way forward, because these tools that we have available, they are provenly capable of elevating productivity beyond realms that we could previously imagine. They're provenly capable of elevating quality beyond realms that we could imagine. Again, I'm thinking about this broader definition of quality, not just focused on the source, but focused on the impact. But taking that step back, that's the part of God giving us strength. That's the part of really believing that you can do it, that it may be frustrating for a while. It may be very difficult for a while, but it is worth it. It's worth the pain. It's worth the investment. It's worth the challenge. And if you were able to get into that space where you're able to harness all of the power of the AI to your advantage, in my opinion, it's nearly guaranteed that you will have a lot of relevance in the marketplace, that you will make a lot of money, and that you will continue to prosper as a translator. But without that transformation, it's almost certain that all your methodologies, all your style, all your knowledge will become, if not obsolete, just too expensive for it to be compatible with the needs that I see rising. But those are my perspectives. Obviously, everything I'm saying may be completely inaccurate. It's what I believe in. I talk to a lot of people every single day. Meetings, that's my job. We implement translation management systems at very large scale global companies like Coca-Cola, like Uber, like Zendesk. So we have a pretty good idea of things that are going on in the world. And at the same time, we focus a lot on the linguistic experience within the editor because we believe that is the core of what we do. So thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear any comments, questions. Would love for you to try out BureauWorks. It's free. But not just try giving it a shot for a day. Really try it. Really try to make it work for you. I know the tool is going to be different than what you're used to. We have great support. We have great a great community with over 1,000 members, with people that help each other figure things out, support each other. But again, when we say try, I don't just mean give it a shot. I mean really give it your best to make it happen, because there's a lot of things that are still worth it. Thanks so much for listening, and really appreciate your time. Till next time.